A November Pew poll indicates that most Americans support helping Ukraine, yet roughly a quarter believe that Washington today has been providing way too much assistance. Given the fact that today, at the end of the 2024, we're still watching the war in Ukraine. And meanwhile, let's keep in mind the US is also facing numerous challenges. And from the domestic affairs, for example, illegal immigration, financing the national debt, competition with China, war in the Middle East, and most importantly, that the countries around the world today are also facing this unpredictable global security environment at the same time. Again, as we mentioned before, more than 1,000 days, and towards the end of the year, we're still watching the war in Ukraine. And how should we understand this political dominance of Vladimir Putin towards the nation of Ukraine? And from the historical perspective, why is it important for us to understand what happened in the past in order to interpret what will happen in the future? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Eugene Finkel. Dr. Finkel is the Kenneth H. Keller Professor of International Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And he recently came out with this amazing book. It's called Intent to Destroy: Russia's 200-Year Quest to Dominate Ukraine. Well, Professor Finkel, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, Professor, it's such an honor to have you on the show. Now, let's get started. Within the book, that this is something that you pressed over and over again, and I do want to read first and want to get your further explanation, and I quote, Russia's quest to dominate and occasionally physically destroy Ukraine has long been driven by two key factors: identity and security. Let's talk about identity first. When we look at this geopolitical uncertainty and also this economic schedule, there is no surprise that identity today is woven deeply with political ideology. Now, from your perspective, let's look at the war, look at what's happening today on the ground. Why do you think it's so important for us to understand, especially from your perspective, the word identity in the midst of the war in Ukraine? Your thoughts?
Right. I think it's important to understand the identity component of the war because it is the core issue driving Russian behavior, and I think we will not be able to solve this war and get to a real peace unless we understand what this war is about. Because you mentioned, the current geopolitical situation, and of course, the war in Ukraine is very much in the agenda, and various plans, or maybe plans floating around how to solve this war, but they all focus on territory, which part of the territory that Russia occupies should remain Russia, what will happen to territory, or security arrangements should Ukraine be or not be in NATO. But that, in my view, missing the biggest cause, and that's identity, and that's the Russian belief that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and that Moscow has a natural right to control Kiev. And unless we address that, then all those discussions about, what slice of land Russia controls, they're meaningless because they don't solve the core issue of the conflict. So I think it's crucial to understand what the origins of the war if we want to understand how to fix it.
Well, let's move on with our next question. Again, Professor, you're the expert. I'm certainly that you wrote this book. When we talk about, again, going back to my intro, it's impossible to understand the current affairs without looking at the history. So in other words, we know there's a strong correlation between the past and the present, and also in order to predict and also interpret the future. Now, I want to move on to my question to this term, what we call the political ideology. Again, this is something that you, Professor, as a political scientist, I'm sure that it's nothing new to you. But when we look at the war in Ukraine, and also we look at the political agenda under Vladimir Putin at this moment, this is one of the critical questions that everyone is asking. Now, fast forward more than 1,000 days. how much do we believe, or how much do you believe from your expertise, that we're dealing with more related to political ideology instead of political ambition? I mean, again, I'm not a political scientist, but I know those two things can go hand in hand with each other, but also they're two separate issues. So from your perspective, let's talk about the past. Talk about what's happened in the past. Do you think that today, because of the past, because of the history, are we actually paying more attention to Putin's political ideology, or we're actually looking at his political ambition for this international global dominance? What do you say to that?
Absolutely. So I think that, as you mentioned, they go hand in hand. But our approach to not just Russia, but more generally, we political scientists are trained to be a bit of cynical people. We are
Mm,
trained to, look at cold interest. We believe in rational actors, or at least those are the dominant approaches. And over the years, as we try to, look and measure and quantify those things and make our study of politics more scientific, we did lose quite a lot of focus on, ideas and ideology and those motivations because we can't quantify that and we can't measure them. So instead, we started assuming that people and politicians are rational. And you saw it before the war in Ukraine, where Putin was literally screaming at us. That's what I believe. I believe that Ukraine is not a real state. I believe that they are the same as Russians. That have been separated from us. That we have a right to control them, and everyone around, and everyone in the West, in the Western academia, were like, no, he doesn't. It's actually about territory, it's about NATO, it's about security guarantees. It's not about ideology. And I have to admit that I also downplayed a bit, the role of ideology and nationalism in Putin's thinking. But apparently he was screaming at us and we were not listening. And what we discovered since the invasion, by looking at what Russia does, by looking at, who they target, what they target, their policies, their rhetoric, they're actually true believers.
mm,
They are driven less about, cold security and more about the idea that Ukrainians or Russians who have been, separated by some mistake of history from Russia, and the role of Russia is to bring them back under Moscow's control. Now, whether it's about world domination, I don't think it's about world domination. I don't think Putin wants to dominate the world, but he certainly wants to carve out a much larger, much more substantial role for Russia in the world, and for that he also needs Ukraine. So
mm.
those things don't go hand in hand. He's definitely not about invading the US or destroying democracy as such. But he definitely wants to revive Russia as a great imperial power. And Ukraine is the first necessary step, because without Ukraine there is no Russian empire and there is no great Russia. So it's both, essentially.
Professor, let's go back to the book. And again, this is amazing read. And again, excuse me that I have not even finished reading yet. But again, as I mentioned in the intro, the more I read about it, and also the more fascinating it is to come up with those questions. But let's go back to one of the chapters that it's called Making a Model Republic. Now, within this chapter, Professor, you mentioned something where you wrote something quite interesting, and I quote, "The communist regime survived and barely saved by the Americans. The American Relief Administration, a humanitarian organization established by future U.S. President Herbert Hoover, undertook a massive relief effort." Now, again, from this historical perspective, Professor Finkel, can you briefly walk us through what should we understand about this American Relief Administration, and why was it critical to talk about President Herbert Hoover and also this communism ideology, where there's the presence of communism? And again, we understand that from the historical perspective, that communism was not just a word on the table, was not just a word in the dictionary, but it was actually a philosophy running through the country, or running through almost the half of the world. But again, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Soviet Unions, This something quite it's something that has been missing in the history that you brought into the book. So let's start from there. What is the purpose of that?
Right. So thanks. I'm glad you like the book. So essentially, the passage that you mentioned is actually one of the curious continuities in history where whenever Soviet Union or Russia tried to collapse, the U.S. either comes in and saves them, as in the case that you mentioned, or in the case of former Soviet Union, does what it can to save communism, but fails when Soviet Union collapsed. So what the period that you mentioned and I'm talking about is the period immediately after World War I and the Communist Revolution, where there is a civil war throughout the former Russian Empire between the monarchists and the communists and the various nationalist forces. And the communist government tries to assert control, but communism is mostly an urban ideology. It has nothing to offer the peasants. Peasants are not into communism or sharing the means of production. Or it's an ideology that is offered to and for the working class, and therefore the base of the communist regime are the cities. It's the proletariat, the urban working class in the factories in the large cities, and the Lenin and communist government understands it very well. Without the support of the cities, they don't have a government, but they need to feed those cities. Those
Mm.
cities cannot feed themselves, and the food can come only from the peasants who are hostile to communism and hostile to this idea of sharing property and the means of production. So, and they're also politically and socially more conservative, more religious than the urban working class, and they have no incentive to provide those cities with food. So instead, the communist government starts using force to expropriate food from the peasants. They send thousands and thousands of armed workers to the countryside to essentially take grain by force and bring it to the cities to feed the regime. But that also sends a signal to the peasants that there is no incentive to produce food because this food is going to be taken anyway. Coupled with that, there is a drought in Russia, and the result is a massive.
Mm.
And the entire Russia is starving the regions that are especially hard hit, Central Russia and Ukraine. And despite all the hatred of capitalism and the West, the communist regime just goes out with an extended hand and start begging for help and begging for food to solve this famine,
Mm.
which is getting really worse. We still don't know how many people died, but we're talking about millions. There is cannibalism. There are horrible stories coming out of Russia. And President Hoover, who is back then not yet a president, he is the Secretary of Commerce. And the organization that he created during World War I to feed and provide humanitarian relief to mostly Central and Western Europe, so France, Belgium, step in and start feeding Russia. And they essentially saved communism from collapse without this American investment. Sorry, not investment, without this American assistance. The Soviets simply would not have been able to feed themselves and survive. But thanks to this US help, they hold on to power, survive, and we see the same pattern of when communism is not an efficient
Mm.
economic system. So whenever they're in really deep crisis, the West would come in and save them. It happens in 1920s, happened in 1980s with less success, happened in 1990s, but communism was an economically absolutely horrible and inefficient way of running the
Mm.
state that led to many famines in which millions died.
Mm.
And that's one of the horrors of communism that I document in this book, because it was also heavily centered on Ukraine in 1920s and 1950s. There is another famine in 1940s that I'm not talking about. But Ukraine, despite being extremely fertile land suffered multiple famines under the Soviet simply because of how the system was set up.
Professor, there's another perspective, again, as we mentioned at the beginning of the book, and I want to bring into our conversation. And surely, again, when we talk about communism, when we talk about the disaster of communism, it's not just about what you have written in the book, and of course, that again, from the historical perspective, there are so many facts that we cannot deny today. Now, let's talk about another key factor that Russia's quest to destroy Ukraine, which is the word security. I mean, again, I want to read something that based on the report, and again, now from your book, but let's get to our discussion. Now, experts believe that without U.S. support, Russia would advance in 2025 as Kyiv runs out of weapons. By 2026, Ukraine will lose effective air defense, allowing Russia to conduct continual large-scale bombing of military and civilian infrastructure. I mean, again, Professor, we know that this geopolitical game, it's rather unpredictable. After this U.S. presidential election in this year, President-elect Donald Trump, again, has already insinuated during numerous occasions that regarding sending the aid to Ukraine, so there's a possibility that Donald Trump or President-elect Trump is going to put a halt or eliminate that. So from your perspective, and also looking at what you wrote in the book, how does that relate to the issue of security? Do you think that today, when we look at Ukraine, when we look at the resources to Kyiv, people should be very concerned, or we say the Ukrainians should be very concerned if United States were to stop all the aid to Ukraine? So what does that say to the Ukraine, and also what does that say to Russia's ambition to destroy Ukraine? Your thoughts?
Right. So I don't know, where this quote that you brought comes from, but it's certainly possible. It's probably, a worst case scenario. I don't think it's very likely, but well, I mean, and one of the things that I tried to do in the book is, to refocus the understanding of Russian actions to ideology and identity, but it's not just ideology and identity. Security does play a role. Now, where does security come in? Russia is a land that has very few natural defenses between it and Europe, and that's why it has been invaded many times from the West and from the East. It's a country that lives in a constant siege mode, in a constant trade mode. Part of it it's self-imposed, parts of it is just fear of retribution for what Russia does. But Ukraine is crucial for Russian security. There are natural defenses between Ukraine and Central Europe. There are marshes, there are mountains, there are rivers. There are none between Russia and Ukraine. It's just an open steppe from central Ukraine up until, up to China and Mongolia, essentially. So that's why control of Ukraine is so crucial for Russia, and that's why they try to dominate Ukraine on top of identity. Where does it play a role now in the current situation? Well, that's to some degree where the fear of Ukraine joining NATO comes from. I don't think it's the key concern, because there are many countries around Russia who are already in NATO, and Russia did not react to that vehemently. But they're certainly thinking about Ukraine in terms of the military. They mentioned both defensive but also offensive. It's much easier to threaten the rest of Europe if you control Ukraine rather than if you do not. In terms of what can come, with you mentioned President-elect Trump. Honestly, I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's definitely not a good development for Ukraine. And yes, I think there is a chance of U.S. aid going down substantially. I don't think it will stop the war, though. I think there will be an attempt to reach a ceasefire. I don't know how successful it will be, because I don't see any indication that Russians are serious about a ceasefire, at least now. So my guess is that the war will continue, but without much of US aid for Ukraine. What it will mean moving forward? Well, probably Europeans will have to provide more. Probably it will be very painful for Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are unhappy with the Biden administration, but they're also very concerned about, what Trump might bring. But in the long run, I think that this Russian focus on security and identity does not bode well, neither for Ukraine nor for the NATO, nor for NATO more generally. NATO, from their perspective, is a threat, and now with Ukraine, if Ukraine is out of the picture, it will be much easier for Russia to threaten NATO.
Professor Finkel, I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about what's happening on the ground today. I mean, again, I'm not done with reading your book yet, but I want to bring another country, or should we say several countries, into our conversation. For example, we look at North Korea, and also we'll look at Vietnam, and also we'll look at China. So, Professor, from your perspective, as a historian, as a political scientist, and also the author of the amazing book, how should we understand about those countries? I mean, right now we do have the confirmation that North Korea and also Vietnam have been providing weapons to Russia, and also have been actively building up or strengthening this trading relationship with Russia. At this moment, how concerning is for the international community? I mean, again, this is the end of 2024, and no one would like to see the war drag on for another year, and no one would like to see the civilians or even the citizens in both countries suffering. I mean, again, we've seen and also we've heard those devastating, heart-wrenching stories over and over again. So from your perspective, how do we see those air quote friends or partners, whatever you call them, to Russia? And how do you think that from the historical perspective that Ukraine is able to stand up against those unspeakable powers? What do you say to that?
Right. So I think we should be very concerned, and not just about North Korea, and not just about Ukraine, because I think we are entering something new that we still don't really understand. Why they're doing it? There are several reasons. So my colleague at Johns Hopkins, Ann Applebaum, just published a book, Autocracy, in where her argument is that autocracies simply help each other out. They bail each other out, and that explains quite a lot about the behavior of countries like North Korea and China. Now, with Assad going and Russia and Iran barely lifting a finger, maybe there are some exceptions to that, but certainly we do see some kind of, grand, if not coalition, then cooperation between autocracies against the West, and it did not start and it will not stop with Ukraine. Yesterday, Yaroslav Trofimov at Wall Street Journal published a long article asking, well, maybe World War III already started, with this axis of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. I'm a bit skeptical about that, because you can't have a world war when only one side is fighting. And for now, the West is not fighting and have no interest in fighting. So what we see in Ukraine is essentially acting as a buffer between Russia and maybe broader authoritarian coalition, preventing this war from starting and drawing most of that. If Ukraine falls, then some things will definitely happen to the West, and it might happen. So yes, I think we absolutely need to be concerned about the cooperation between Russia, China, and North Korea, and most people in the West still do not understand the gravity of the situation. I think we do entering a period of large-scale violence and crisis that will not stop with Ukraine. So whether World War III already started, I don't think so. But if Ukraine, and it might not start if Ukraine falls. I think if Ukraine falls, then the chances of a much larger global conflict go up, and that's, I think, is West in Western interest to support Ukraine.
Mm.
If Ukraine falls, it will also give China some thoughts about Taiwan. It might give some thoughts to North Korea about the South. So we will enter a period of great geopolitical instability, and I don't know how it's going to play out. But I'm personally very scared.
Well, again, I'm sure, Professor, you're not the only one. Again, no one would like to see another world war next year. Now, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called Intent to Destroy: Russia's 200-Year Quest to Dominate Ukraine. Professor, at this moment, I mean, again, I'm not going to say that for anyone who's unfamiliar with the war in Ukraine, but because we're still looking at the facts, we're looking what's happening today. The last question I always ask every single amazing author: what would you expect the readers to understand and appreciate when we finish reading the last chapter of your book? I mean, again, because this is accumulation. It's not just about what happened in the past. This is not accumulation about what's happening today. It's more about a warning. It's more about this reminders that when it comes to war, when it comes to a power dominance or competition, there are things that we need to keep in mind. And also there are things that we need to bear in mind as leaders, as civilians, and also as international community. So again, the final question, Professor, briefly from your perspective, what are your expectations from the readers?
Well, probably not expectations, but hopes. There are several. The first hope is for them to understand that, the war in Ukraine did not start in 2022 and not even 2014. And there is a long history of Russian efforts to control Ukraine and Russian violence in Ukraine. And it's crucial to know about and to understand, if you want to understand this war. I think another hope is that we can switch the conversation from technical issues like territory and security guarantees to addressing the core issue of the conflict, and that's identity and ideology, because without it, there will be no long-lasting peace, and we will just, defer or postpone the next war. So to push very strongly for talking about those things when we talk about how to solve this war and how to achieve peace. And third, as a warning that leaders whose thinking is dominated by history and historical myths and driven by those historical myths and want to recreate the glorious past are very dangerous things. And right now, it's in Ukraine, but it's not just Ukraine. We can look at many places in the world where we see quite a lot of violence against civilians driven by those historical ideologies and historical grievances and leaders who want to recreate this glorious past. So just as another warning about dangers of doing politics based on history, especially if this history is a myth rather than fact. So that's pretty much it, I would say.
Well, again, Professor, surely, as we mentioned over and over again, this is such an timely, appropriate book and for the international community to read and also to understand. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Eugene Finkel. Again, Dr. Finkel is the Kenneth H. Keller Professor of International Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And his latest book, which is called Intent to Destroy: Russia's 200-Year Quest to Dominate Ukraine. Professor, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We'd love to have you back on the show for future episodes. So thank you so much for doing this.